Okay. Right, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jo Ridley. Ro's given you a really lovely introduction to me. So I work at Oxford Brookes, and my EdD has been undertaken at Oxford Brookes, but my work role, is within widening participation. So I work with relatively disadvantaged young people in schools and colleges within the region, so southern England, roughly, but not the whole of it, to promote routes into higher education. So that's not just university, it might be higher and degree apprenticeship, that sort of thing, as well as exploring career options for them. And the EdD, because it's a professional doctorate, is for people wanting to do doctoral study alongside their professional roles or linked to their professional role. So in that case, so in relation to that, I wanted to look at how young people aspire to the future and how that might differ across different socio-economic groups. So this is the title of my thesis, and these are my three research questions. And I'll talk about the concept of possible selves shortly, but you'll also see that I wanted to explore how class within the UK might be impacting upon the nature of young people's possible selves and how they aspire to the future. Next slide, please. Thanks. So maybe a bit of context will help. So as I'm sure is the situation in many other parts of the world, up until the late 20th century, the participation in higher education was the purview of the elite. And it's only in recent, in the second half of the 20th century and onwards, that we've seen the massification of higher education, so that it's been opened up to wider groups within society. But that massive increase in participation hides, within the UK in particular, and it may be similar in other countries, a real gap between the participation rates across socio-economic groups. So you can see the couple of stats here about how they differ according to the quintile group that young people are within, and the gap of 38 points between the top and bottom socio-economic groups within the UK. It'd be good to find out maybe after the presentation how that mirrors what's going on elsewhere. So next slide, please. Up until the last decade or so, one of the drivers within government policy in relation to participation in higher education has been this idea that young people and the communities that they come from generally have really low aspirations, and that impacts upon their willingness or desire to move on to higher education. And these are just two statements that come out of government papers that have influenced not only policy in relation to widening participation, but also strategy. So how bodies such as mine, so I work for an organisation called Study Higher, how they have developed strategy for working with young people. And so until the last decade or so, it's been very much focused around how do we raise young people's aspirations. But there's a growing body of evidence showing that young people across socioeconomic groups have high aspirations. It's just that young people from relatively disadvantaged communities don't know how to achieve their goals that they have for themselves. The horizons that they have are much more limited too. They have less understanding about the opportunities that are out there for them. So next slide, please. Yeah. So as I mentioned at the outset, I really want to focus on the role of class in terms of shaping young people's thoughts about the future. Now, I know that in other parts of the world there are socio-economic disparities and other systems that categorize people according to their position within society. But within I think the UK class system is a system of itself. It's really quite interesting to explore. And up until recently, there has been a a lessening of interest in wanting to explore how class, the role of class within society. There has been a general feeling that it has become less important, and the inequality within our society is more structured by socio-economic issues rather than people's class position. That view has changed somewhat in recent years. There's been growing theoretical interest in how class continues to have a place within people's lives and how it structures their opportunities, and what's available to them. The stuff I've got here is on this slide is just about the structure of the UK class system in past years and as it's evolving in recent years. And the pictures on the right, the top two pictures are of the Eton schoolboys. The middle picture shows Boris Johnson, our past Prime Minister. Many of our current politicians and Prime Ministers come from Eton, which is one of the primary public schools for the UK. Bottom picture is just a random picture of a school. Next slide, please. This clip, I've got, Vivian's got it lined up later. If there's time, it's a really lovely clip by, I don't know if anybody recognises them. It's two Ronnies. There are comedians within the UK that they are no longer around, unfortunately, but they were icons within the UK comedy scene. And John Cleese, who you may know, they did a really iconic sketch about the UK class system. So if there's time at the end and we have a soft close, we've got the clip lined up if you want to watch it. Is there anything else I want to say on there? No, I think next slide, please. So yeah, my research has focused on the concept of possible selves, which was first created by Marcus and Urius in 1986. So possible selves are the images that we all have of ourselves, young or old, which we have of ourselves in the future. It might be what we feel we might be like next week, next year, or in 10 years' time. These are images of ourselves that can be positive, possible selves that we want to work towards, or they might be possible selves that we would want to avoid, and they will impact on the behaviour and the decisions that we make in the present. They're very much framed by our experiences and our past history. And they also reflect the interrelationship between structure, so the socio-economic position, for instance, that we're in, and also our personal agency, how we reflect on our own situation and how we might want to move forward with where we want to go. Next slide, please. So my methodological approach. So as we've already mentioned, it's based on the work of Kerpelman and colleagues who used Q to explore the concept of possible selves, but in the US context, and they worked with college-age students. I wanted to build on their work by adapting it for the UK context. So, and to a great extent, that meant changing quite a lot of the language that they use, which is very much US focused. And also making sure that it was appropriate for Year 9 students. So these are young people who have just chosen their options for the qualifications that the level 3 qualifications that they'll be working towards. And part of that process, they will be them having lots of lessons and input from educators about the careers that they might want to choose. So there'll be a big focus on, you need to think about the career that you want to do. You need to think about yourself in the future. What does that mean for the qualifications that you want to work towards? So that's why I wanted to that's why I wanted to work with Year 9 students, age 13 to 14. Now, one of the controversial aspects of my research, I now know, after becoming very much involved with the Q community, was that Kerpelman and colleagues used a very large Q set. They used actually a 100-item Q set. It worked for them, and they produced some really useful research. I ended up with a 90-item Q set, and I went through periods of thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Especially as I became more involved with Q, more knowledgeable about the general advice about sizes of Q sets. But ultimately, it has led the Q set has allowed me to produce some really good results and data, and 3 identified factors and viewpoints that I will talk about shortly. So yeah, so that's one aspect of the research that I did find a little bit problematic as I was working through the research itself. I piloted the QSAT with a group of non-participating students in a local school. That went really, really well. A couple of tweaks on some of the statements, but that was fine. And then I'll talk shortly about the 2-stage process of my research, but it was accompanied by semi-structured interviews with 7 participants whose Q sorts in the identified factors were exemplar sorts for those 3 identified factors. I'll also talk very briefly about the MacArthur scale of subjective social status. It was a tool I used that was in relation to the focus on class and people's views about where they sit compared to other people. I'll talk very briefly about it shortly, but the findings from it weren't necessarily that interesting, so I don't want to dwell on it too much. So next slide, please. Yeah, so going back to the point about interviews, you will know, because most of you are experts in the Q fields, will know that for most Q studies, interviews that tend to take place alongside the Q sorting process itself, and they very much focus on participants' rationale for the placement of their statements, and they aim to sort of capture the meaning behind people's decisions in relation to the placing of statements and the Q sorting activity. There are a number of practical and theoretical reasons why I didn't take that approach. So in terms of practical reasons, I was working with a relatively young age group, so year 9s, and also with a relatively large Q set. And I didn't feel that they would have the willingness or the attention span to want to answer questions about the placement of their statements immediately after they'd done the activity. For me, because I was working with a relatively large group of participants as well, so 60 in total across 2 schools, it was that would have been quite a labor-intensive process as well if I included it within the Q sorting activity. And in practical terms as well, it was too challenging to fit within the school day, because the Q sorting activity was scheduled around their school timetable. But the theoretical reasons why I separated the interviews from the Q sorting activity was because I really wanted to delve into the identified viewpoint. So I needed to do the factor analysis on the Q sorting activity to identify distinct viewpoints that I then wanted to explore further using the the semi-structured interviews, but also because I wanted to then explore through those interviews participants' views about class, and also how the statements, the comments that they made might have been classed in one way or another. So that's why I had this 2-stage process. So next slide, please. This is my coding frame. I don't know if you can see it in detail, but so it illustrates how I coded the interviews, the post-sorting interviews. So as well as looking, coding for comments related to the 3 identified viewpoints, and there's a clue here as to what they were called. So the viewpoints are on the left-hand side. I also coded according to different types of aspiration, for instance. references to class and class comments in general, and also, and I'll talk a bit more about this shortly, my wider theoretical framework, which was critical realist, so looking at structure, agency, demi-regularities and different causal mechanisms. So that's a general coding frame for the interview stage. So next slide, please. I'm not very good at timing my presentations. We may whiz through this presentation in about 20 minutes. I've no idea. I've never been good at that. So demographic breakdown of participants, you'll see here that there were two schools. My original aim at the outset of the whole research was that I would be working with a range of schools within what's called the state sector within the UK. So non-fee paying schools that your average Joe in the street will go to, and also independent schools or public schools which are largely fee paying and are obviously because they're fee paying, then more affluent young people will go to them. And I wanted to look at the diversity of viewpoint across those different socio-economic groups. That didn't happen primarily because of COVID. The vast majority of schools who had been considering participating in the research were no longer willing or able to. There were some where my contacts were willing to continue being involved, but the wider trust hierarchy that controlled what the school did were much more strict about their involvement with anything that wasn't core curriculum delivery. I ended up working with just two schools, and that really worried me at one point that I wouldn't be able to get that diversity of viewpoint. But in a way, it shows the strength of Q in that the participant group that I had to work with was relatively homogenous, but I was still able to identify and to identify three distinct viewpoints within that relatively homogenous group, which I think is a real strength of Q because it can identify hidden subjectivity. So Fraser Academy is mixed school, so boys and girls in a semi-rural part of the region, southern England. St Aidan's School is a single-sex faith school, and as a result, it has quite a diverse ethnic cohort. So people from families from across different ethnic minority groups are drawn towards St Aidan's School because of the single-sex nature and because it's got a faith focus. So there was quite an ethnic mix in my participant group as well. And once I was able to engage with those two schools, I used convenient sampling to recruit participants. So the young people were invited to take part. They were told, and their parents, because of the age, they were told at all stages that their participation was confidential, that it was totally voluntary. They could pull out at any time, and it wasn't linked to their grades. They wouldn't get into trouble if they decided to pull out at a later stage. And that was made clear both through the information sheets and through the consent forms that the young people and their parents signed. So next slide, please. So this is an image of the one of the grids that they completed. It doesn't really do it justice here. It's A2 and it's fabric. I was really pleased. I worked with the design and print team within Oxford Brookes, and they came and I said, I need to produce something like this that's really transportable and easy to use. And they came up with, and it's printed on this sort of crinkly little fabric, and it's really quite a pleasure to use, and the young people really enjoyed it as well. And this is just shows you one of the young people just completing their Q sort. I think in hindsight, I would have had a more shallow grid, and the experts in the group here will tell me whether they feel that might have produced different results. But again, I was able to produce three distinct viewpoints using this shape of grid, but I think it's quite deep for the number of statements that I was expecting them to sort. So next slide, please. And these are examples of statements. It's a bit small here, so I've only got some of them there. It shows you the sorts of statements that they were sorting. So on the left-hand side, they largely relate to different job roles that they might have. And on the right-hand side, these are more around a possible self that relate to quality of life and what you might have when you're in the future. So in terms of financial investments, ability to buy designer clothes, those sorts of things. So they're the sorts of statements that they were sorting. So next slide, please. So in terms of results, as I've mentioned, so the COVID meant that the diversity of the P set was much reduced. And I at one point thought that that would really scupper the research, but in a way was a strength because it identified how Q can be used to unearth often hidden viewpoints within a relatively homogeneous group. I've talked about the structure of the two schools. I used CADE, so CanQ analysis desk addition. One of the issues, and I spoke about this when at the previous conference, my relative lack of confidence and experience of Q meant that I decided to rely on PCA and Varamax rotation rather than going for centroid and going for the more hands-on approach to factor analysis. Now, that was partly because I wanted to be sure that I got robust results, the statistical side of things was robust, but also because I knew that at one point I will need to defend my research, and I didn't have the confidence that I would be able to defend it, having done my own factor analysis without having the structure of PCA and Varamax around me. I know that in general, the general feeling is that centroid factor analysis is preferred. But for me, at my stage in my Q journey, that felt more doable. For someone who isn't a numbers person, it also helped my ability to get on top of the statistical side of the analysis, really, and that's a real achievement for me because I am not a numbers person, I'm a words person. Yeah, so it made it much more manageable for me, really. So I don't think there's anything more I want to say on that. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the a complete rotated factor matrix, and it separates the three different viewpoints. I hope everyone can see the full slide. I know sometimes the people's faces get in the way a little bit. As with most, quite often, I'm not going to say most, I don't know whether it's most, but quite often with Q studies, there is one stronger viewpoints and other viewpoints that may not be quite as strong, and that was the case with mine. So we've got the first viewpoint was the strongest, and there were two slightly less strong viewpoints. On these tables, you will see that it's got the Q sort code number, the age and gender and ethnicity of each Q sorter. The columns that say L1, L2, and L3 relate to the MacArthur scale of subjective social status, and we'll see that shortly. And then you've got the scores for each of the factors here, the viewpoints here for each of the sorters. So next slide, please. And this is the MacArthur scale. So so quite often when we want to research people's socio-economic positions, We use objective measures such as financial income or jobs, the type of job someone has, those are sorts of objective measures. But for there is a growing interest in using the subjective focusing on people's subjective views about where they are in relation to other people. So the MacArthur scale, and this is the youth edition, asks participants to rate themselves according to in relation to other people around them. So for instance, in this scale, so actually the original MacArthur scale just has one ladder, but with my supervisors, we decided to split people's views according to how they viewed themselves in relation to others, according to their financial wealth, education, and quality of life. And the reason I did this, because I wanted to relate it to my focus on class and where the participants felt they fitted within wider society and how that might relate to the viewpoints that emerged from the Q study. At the bottom, I used the opportunity to ask them for their views about their ethnic group and also their gender, etc. So that's, again, I use that the space on that tool to gather that information as well. I won't. I can talk to you about the results for the subjective social status there. They weren't particularly that interesting or useful for my research, so I won't dwell on them here. But if anyone wants to talk more about them later on or at a later date, I'm more than happy to go into what the results were for me and I think the limitations of the scale for research generally. But next slide, please. So I'll now turn to the 3 viewpoints. And the following slides, there's 2 slides for each viewpoint. The first slide brings together the strongest statements within that viewpoint. And there's paraphrasing in there to make them flow into a general larger statement about that summarizes that viewpoint, the nature of that viewpoint. And it also includes a little bit from the interviews as well to give it much more of a holistic feel about summarizing the viewpoint itself. So for instance, informed aspiration. So these were, and this is the strongest factor, and these were young people who felt relatively confident that they had support to progress to higher education, and they saw higher education as part of their future. They weren't necessarily being strong-armed by parents into progressing to higher education, which is the case for some young people from more affluent backgrounds, where higher education is seen as the natural thing to do once you've finished your compulsory education. They saw it as an option for them, and they also, the peers around them, their friends, were also of an ilk that they also saw higher education in their futures as well. And in terms of roles, they talked quite a lot about professional roles, such as going into medicine and that sort of thing. And they were relatively confident that they would achieve the aspirations that they had thought of for themselves. And for the, next slide, I'm trying to press the slide. Next slide, please. So for instance, here are a couple of statements from the interviews, which illustrate that although their parents weren't, as I say, expecting them to definitely go on to higher education, there was the support there for them if that's what they chose to do. There's quite a high level of agency within this viewpoint in terms of them being able to choose what they wanted to do and feel confident that what they chose would be supported by those around them. So next slide, please. So risk uncertainty is the name given to the second viewpoint. And this group, it's quite interesting, were much more reticent about their ability to achieve any aspirations that they had for themselves. They were much more negative about their current circumstances and more aware of disparities within their wider community. So, for instance, so St Aidan's is in an urban area which has quite a mix of relatively affluent but quite disadvantaged areas within it. So there is evidence of poverty that they will experience around them. And this group in particular was more aware of those sorts of instances around them. They also seem to have fewer role models able to guide their thinking and to help them think about what might be possible in the future. And there was more instance of, and this came out from the interviews, more instance of young peers, so they're young people around them, being taking them away, sort of being not bad influences, but influencing them in ways that didn't benefit their education, so drew them away from school stuff, as this young person, as this statement says. They were, and that in terms of different roles, they were tended to be more creative in terms of being a designer or game designer, and less focused on professional roles such as doctor or lawyer. Next slide, please. And yeah, so here are a couple of statements from one person in particular, Alice. I've changed the names, so it's not a real person thing, who talks about the risks associated to going to university and the idea that it costs a lot of money and that might be a barrier to participating. So next slide, please. But the most interesting one for me was the final factor or viewpoint which I entitled ambivalent ambition. And that is a real contrast in that the general feel from the Q-sort activity and from the interviews was that they were relatively focused, ambitious, and focused on that having an affluent lifestyle and having the trappings of an affluent lifestyle. So, for instance, designer clothes, multiple holidays a year, but they were least able to express how they might achieve those trappings, had far less access to role models or influencers who might guide them on their journeys forward into different careers or into life after, fly in front of me, life after school. Oh, sorry, can you go back? Sorry. And yeah, so ambition. Yeah, so yeah, so fewer role models and fewer people in the wider community that were able to act as inspirational role models for them in terms of identifying routes forward. So next slide, please. And yeah, so here are a couple of statements. So one of the things, so there are a theorist called Zippin, I don't know if anyone's heard of him, who talks about doxic and habituated aspirations. And this group in particular, this viewpoint in particular, highlighted the influence of doxic aspirations. So these are aspirations that are influenced by wider societal discourse. And so there's so much discourse around having an impressive lifestyle, having the trappings of a wealthy lifestyle that comes through social media that young people will have access to. And these sorts of doxic aspirations were particularly highlighted within this viewpoint, in contrast to habituated aspirations, which are much more focused on personal experience guiding our aspirational thinking. So next slide, please. And then focusing much more on sort of wider influences on aspirational development. Riddell is a theorist who talks about the managed model of aspiration, and he's done quite a bit of work in fee-paying schools where there is much more of an assumption that life is there for the taking, that and much more of a focus on higher education being a core part of what you do. Your role is to go out and get a degree, good qualification, and then the world is your oyster, basically. And the difference between the young people in those situations is that the messages that they're getting from all quarters are similar. So the parents and the schools are all giving the similar messages. And so there is an assumption of the routes that they are able to follow and a normalcy of their aspirations. Whereas for young people from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds, the messages that they're getting from different quarters may be in conflict to each other, and that can lead them to not being able to identify the routes that they can take to achieve the goals that they might personally have, and to confusion about the routes forward. Another theorist is Appidurai, who talked about the ability to aspire, and he talks about a roadmap and how more advantaged young people are able and equipped by the people around them and by their experiences to be able to navigate that roadmap than compared to disadvantaged young people who don't have the knowledge or the support necessarily, or the experience to understand how they can get to where they want to be. Next slide, please. And I mentioned briefly that I used a critical realist theoretical framework, and that just means, and I won't go into detail there because that could be a whole presentation in itself, that I looked at the wider social structures and factors influencing the development of people's the viewpoints that emerged from the Q study, in particular habitus, so the norms and values that are within the families and the wider school system, family history of higher education, and other social markers such as gender and social class that might have been influencing young people's viewpoints and the development, the aspirations that they're able to develop. And without going into too much detail, is looking specifically at causal mechanisms involved that led to the development of particular possible selves that they identified through the research. Next slide, please. I think that might be, yeah, so I'm coming to a conclusion now. So what do I want to say here? Yeah, so I think that Q has been really, really useful for this research in that it's helped to identify the diversity of viewpoint within what is often assumed to be a really homogenous group. And I think one of the issues for widening participation policy and practice within the UK is that it just takes a broad brush approach to working with young people, and that going forward, and I think what this research shows is that we need to be far more nuanced and working with young people individually to identify the factors that might be influencing the way they aspire to the future and the viewpoints that they may have about what's available to them. I'm currently working with my researchers, my supervisor, sorry, to explore how I might do a subsequent Q study that explores the views of parents and educators. And if it all goes ahead, I will definitely be developing a Q set that is guided by the experts within this Q, this Zoom Q, and is very much much more modest in terms of size, and very much focused on that is informed by the learning that I've developed from being a part of the Zoom Q. So I think that's my last slide. Next slide, and I think the next slide is just some references if people want to know more about the background to the research, and I'll happily send them to anybody who wants to have them. So that's just me, really. Oh, and there you go, 47, not too
Wow,
bad.
fantastic. Let's just give a round of applause to Jo. This was
Thank
so
you.
interesting. If I can just find the applause buttons. But
I
I'll
was a
do
bit
that.
worried that
Woo, woo, woo.
I hadn't focused enough on the Q aspect in terms of the technicalities of the Q research methodology, and have been a bit broad brush about the wider project, but hey ho, it is what it is.
I think you did really well, and there are a few questions. Let's take the questions, and then hopefully we will have time to see that snippet, because I'm looking forward to that. So,
It tickles me, but that's all. Yeah. Gareth
Amanda,
will know.
Amanda, do you want to maybe speak to your comment about the theoretical reasons for alternative
No,
interview
thank you. I
approaches?
was just typing as I went in case I have to leave early, and didn't have chance to compliment Jo on some of her decisions, and just to back up some of your choices and your rationalizations. And you did, in my view, a really excellent job giving those interpretations. So I really enjoyed those presentations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Amanda. And yes, Amanda spoke of the well justified. Nico, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Joanna. Firstly, great presentation. I really enjoyed the topic, especially because I think I was connecting to it on some level. So my question was, is there any institutional pressure in the UK for students to attend higher education? And I asked this is because I attended year 9 in Australia back in 2015, and my friends who went to year 10 just stopped going to school, and they're actually doing really well for themselves. Some maybe even opening trading businesses. So I just wanted to know, is it that thing of in the UK, you have to go, higher education, or it's not really required?
No, there isn't an expectation that you will go on to university. There isn't, and so you're not pressurized to do so. I think the drivers are that the government is aware that there are skills gaps within our workforce, and so they appreciate that having a diverse group going to university means that we will be able to fill those skills gaps. But there's also the moral side of things, the moral drivers in terms of people being able to achieve their full potential, and higher education for many people offers them the opportunity to do that. But no, there are, and but I am disillusioned in my role, in that I know all the theory behind it. I know I work in a role that an idea is working towards enabling young people to go to university and achieve their goals. But the reality of higher education is that it is still really stratified. There are universities that you simply will not get into if you've not come from the particular schools, or you've not achieved the absolute top grades. And actually getting those top grades is so much more difficult for young people from working class communities, because they don't have access to quality education in the first place. It's not evenly distributed across society within the UK, and I'm sure in lots of other parts of the world as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Sorry, I've been speaking. Fantastic. Thank you very much. That is on the one hand so sad. And yeah, we want to.
I worry that I'm part of a system, and this system that's hiding in plain sight, that we're just continuing with a system that is just not fair. But that's a whole other conversation.
Fantastic. Charles, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure, yeah. Excellent presentation, by the way. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, when the excerpts you had from people talking about their experiences, like as part of post-sort interviews, I guess, how did you choose them? I assume they were representative of a given factor. but what, I guess, was it that made you choose them specifically in the way that they sorted their cards that made them stand out to you, I suppose, as being representative?
They just scored most highly on each of the factors. So I invited, intended to invite two from each of the identified viewpoints. There was another young person who scored really, really highly and was particularly keen to be part of she was inspired by the research. I think she likes the idea of becoming a researcher in the future. And because she scored really highly, on the first viewpoint, I interviewed three, but it's strictly from through the scoring that they were the strongest, the exemplar sorts for each of those factors.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right.
Rita's asking how expensive
Yeah,
is it to
Garrett
attend
and
higher education?
Joanna. Yeah, well, Garrett and Joanna has their hand raised before me typing on the chat. So please, yeah, Garrett and Joanna's on iPhone. Joanna's iPhone.
Okay, Joanna.
Sure.
Yeah,
Shall I come in and then over to you, Joanna, and then back to Rita, I guess. Thanks, Joe. Really interesting research and obviously a really important area. I wanted to hear a little. Sorry, I couldn't type. That's why I couldn't ask the question.
Yeah.
For some reason. I wanted to know a bit more about the Q sample because it seemed that you got it from American. You adapted it from American study primarily, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about where they got it from and how, to what extent you understand you believe it covered the whole concourse in this area, and whether you, rather than just tweaking some of the words to make it more UK focused, did you actually add anything that was not part of their discourse, their concourse from the US, and has it changed? Obviously, things change over time, and obviously over space, UK is a very different policy setting. So, in terms of that sample, apart from it just being very big, was that your main reliance on it being covering the whole discourse, or was there any? Did you add anything or change? To adapt it further?
Yeah. So it was large QSAT, and my main focus was ensuring that it covered as wide a range of possible selves categories as possible, and I think it did. I don't think there were particularly any gaps in it from my perspective, and that's my main rationale. As well as tweaking some of the words so that they were UK centric, I changed some of the so rather than just focusing on healthcare, I talked about the NHS and that sort of thing. But there wasn't a massive amount of change that needed to be done to the QSET. I think since since being involved with the Zoom Q discussions, I mourn the fact that I haven't had the experience of developing my own QSET from a wider concourse, and that I'd used Kerpelman's as the basis for my own QSET. I missed that in terms of my own experience of Q, and I'm really looking forward to going through that process when I do my next Q study. But I'm confident that I feel that the QSET I used was sufficiently comprehensive for my work. But yeah.
Yes, thanks, Joe.
Joanna, Joanna's iPhone.
Is that what it says? I'm gonna have to learn to change it or something. Well, maybe I'll help with Rita's question as well, because mine is very close, Joe. I'm wondering about, we've talked a little bit on our Monday calls about policy implications and how we take a Q study and how we craft that or shape that into a sort of policy recommendation. And I feel like the blanket policy recommendation for all Q studies is probably, hey, you treat this thing as a monolith and it's more nuanced than that. Like that's probably every Q study ever. Hey, it's there's more to it than you're kind of treating it in the policy. If you could go a little deeper, and I'm partially saying that selfishly, as we in our current study that's about in Cumbria, what would you do deeper about a policy recommendation? Like if you could kind of probe even more, then look at it more broadly, what might that look like? And this is in the context of the fact, I'm getting handed over to you, that I think it would make a really good ref case study, and you should tell Oxford Brookes that you should be in the ref cycle.
Okay, I will do so. I don't know if I'm understanding your question correctly. One of the things, so our funding, it comes from the Office for Students, and they structure what they feel our widening participation offer should be. Now, and I think there's a great deal of potential there to work directly with the Office for Students to show them that there needs to be a much more nuanced approach to working with young people across the Office for Students Uni Connect program, which is what we're part of. And another opportunity that's come up recently is that from talking to the head of that study hire, she has had contact with Swindon Borough Council, which is actually my home council, that is wanting to, which has a really low level of engagement with higher education across the board. And that's partly because there is lots of low-level employment within our locality. So there's employment, so they don't see the need to go on to higher education. And they are really, really keen to explore how they can work with parents and young people in a different way to identify their drivers and how they might try to instill this view about higher education and engagement in school generally. So I'm about to start talking to them about how we might want to take a sort of Q sort of approach in that respect, building on the research from this research. But I don't know if that's answered your question, hopefully, in part.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Joe, I think let's go to Rita, and then if we could maybe have then the video and a applause again, and then we've got 3 minutes left. So if that's okay with everybody. Rita?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Joanna. I really enjoy your study. You were a little bit concerned about, but the study, the presentation was absolutely nice, logically well structured. I really like. It was simple, but simple. It's not was simple. It was really interesting, and yeah, I agree with Joanna. I found that she kind of covered what I was going to ask you. So I'm going to shift a little bit because I have several other questions to ask you, in the sense that I really agree with you that kind of the third factor you identify as ambivalent ambition was kind of pretty interesting, because you highlight the fact that these guys they have a pretty high ambition, but it looks like they didn't know how to. This is what my understanding from your presentation. You can adjust me if I misunderstood that. So in this regard, I have a kind of two questions. One is more technical on Q, and one is more social policy. The first question on the technical aspect is that I had a quick glance of your statements, and they were mostly, I want to do this, I will be this, I will be that. I saw quickly 2 sentences about my parents will support my study. I can't remember the other one. So my curiosity is how you were able to come out with this kind of elaborate interpretation of all those factors. So this is the technical aspect. The other more policy aspect is that I'm kind of very interested and intrigued by the fact these guys want to do so much, but they don't know how. So how do you think your study or future study, even if you anticipate you are planning for the future, what kind of analysis, what kind of maybe what kind of a Q set you're going to develop if you want to dig more into understanding why this group there is this kind of viewpoint in which I want to have a great life, but I don't know exactly how to get there. So two questions: technical aspect, how you end up with this interpretation, and one more speculation for future studies. Is it okay?
Yeah, if you've got time. I don't know if we have. I think the interpretation is the result of not only the Q set, but also the semi-structured interviews that are able to build on the findings of the Q set that added more depth to it. So I really benefited, I think. I really enjoyed the fact that I had the basic viewpoints that came out through the Q set. And I could really explore those with the young people through the semi-structured interviews. And that had added a real depth to what I felt was my analysis of each of the viewpoints. So that's hopefully a short answer in terms of the first one. So in terms of this, you'll have to repeat the second one. Second question.
The second question is a more general issue emerge. I mean, I would call it issue emerge from this group called ambivalent ambition, which they show an interest to. They want to get a high level of their lifestyles, but you said that it looks like they don't know how to get there. And it looks like they don't have a great exemplar around them or great or looks like even parents support. So I was wondering if that kind of viewpoint can encourage a further analysis as to why you have this group of young people willing to go there without knowing how to. And if that can be addressed by maybe another Q study or other speculations, or something that can inform future policies for UK.
I think there's loads of potential there. I think there's two issues there, and one of them is that they are identifying ambitions that aren't necessarily realistic, and that's where I go back to the toxic influences. In my day job, I've lost count of the young people that I speak to who say, I want to be a lawyer, and they're not studying anything remotely appropriate to become a lawyer, but they just love the TV programs that they see, and so they've got ambitions that are driven by unrealistic factors that are influencing their lives. But also there is so little real investment in careers guidance that for your average young person within a state education state system within the UK, and also no real relationship between schools, colleges and universities that is meaningful. We've got this widening participation process, and we take kids along to campus and show them what a university looks like, but there's no real relationship there, and there's no real relationship with the wider community either in many instances. And that's what's going to be necessary for young people to see university, if that's the part of higher education they want to go to, as relevant to their lives. And it's all about investment in careers guidance so that they can join the dots between what they want to do and how they're going to get there. And that's what I do in terms of my mentoring with young people, is that I try to get them to join the dots and to look at the little steps that they have to do themselves to actually get to the next level. So even if it's just engaging with the current schooling system they've got, which is the biggest challenge for many of them, before they even get any further. But yeah, so I'm not quite sure.
Well, thank you very much. Rita, can we go on? Does that answer your question a bit?
Absolutely, I'm done. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very interesting question. And I think here at the end, Joe, what you actually expressed exactly what the values of your study is, to prove to people now that those steps must be taken in order to help people to connect the dots. So this was really amazing and so interesting. A round of applause for you from everybody. Thank you so much. We're running a little, there's very interesting comments. I'll copy and paste them all for you, but everybody enjoyed it and confirmed that the third factor is very interesting as well. Sue found something similar to college engineering. And I think what we'll do now, if that's okay for everybody, is let's watch that video. And those of you who want to go, or what do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I love this video. It's really light-hearted. It's the two Ronnies. It's just a sweet little skit about the UK class system. It's lovely. It's from years and years ago, but I think it's still really quite pertinent.
Let's watch it. Thank you very much, Vivian, for sharing it.
Oops, what did I just do?
You're doing the
I'm
right
sorry.
thing.
Hold on, make it larger. Ah, sorry. Oh, sorry. Here you go. Apologies.
But I don't look up to him.
Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay.
I look down on him because I am upper class. I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class. I know my place. I look up to them both. But I don't look up to him as much as I look up to him. Because he has got innate breeding. I have got innate breeding, but I have not got any money. Sometimes I look up to him. I still look up to him, because although I have money, I am vulgar. I'm not as vulgar as him, so I still look down on him. I know my place. I look up to them both. But while I'm poor, I'm industrious, honest, and trustworthy. Had I the inclination, I could look down on them. But I don't. We all know our place, but what do we get out of it? I get a feeling of superiority over them. I get a feeling of inferiority from him, but a feeling of superiority over him. I get a pain in the back of my neck.
Okay, that is funny. Thank you so much for that, Joe, and thank you for such an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And everybody for attending. And we're looking forward to our next presentation where other people can join, or else the next Zoom queue next week, Monday. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Well done, Joe. Bye.
Just okay, I can stop the recording.
Why should I stop this music?